Hello everybody, we're talking about side congruency today. Side congruency is talking about triangles and specifically, which is why we mentioned that there are three sides, because triangles have three sides. And we're talking about how we can prove triangles congruent. Now this should make sense. If we notice that we have two sides that are congruent to another two sides of a triangle, and we have a third side that's congruent, it would have to force this angle to be a certain measure because these are only so long, and the only piece that could fit into that opening would cause an angle at this size. Same idea with each of these particular angles. So because we can create three congruent sides and we automatically get three congruent angles on both triangles, we come up with all parts of these triangles congruent, including the angles and sides. And if you remember from CP/CTC, if we have corresponding parts congruent, that makes these triangles themselves congruent. So if we can prove three sides congruent, we automatically get the two triangles altogether congruent. So we need to prove side, side, side congruency. Now, we're not going to do as much algebra with these particular problems as we are with proofs. So let's take one quick second to discuss how we write proofs. This technique that I'm going to be working with is called a statement and reason table. Okay, so first of all, we need to have a table drawn. It's just going to be a T-chart. Okay, split it in half the best that you can. I like to give myself a little bit more room on the statement side than the reasons, because usually the statements are a little bit longer than the reasons, but make them pretty much the same amount. I'm going to write statement and reason. Okay. And then we're also going to make sure that we number both the statement and the reason with the same numbering, so that way we can make sure that we're justifying the proper information with the proper reasoning. Because sometimes you can write a lot of stuff on the statement and then write a little bit on the reason, and it can sometimes get lost and look a little jumbled. So if we make sure to label them, we won't be curious later on as to what's going on. Now, proofs. Proofs are difficult. Here's the best advice I can give you for proofs, okay? Read the given information and mark anything that you notice is either parallel or congruent. That's it. When you find parallel or congruent, mark those things. If not, don't add too much extra to the picture because it's going to get too confusing. If you have too many symbols floating around, it becomes too confusing. So we want to look for things that are congruent and things that could possibly be parallel. Okay? How we judge that? We're going to be starting off looking at the given information. Okay? Now, sometimes it gives it to you right away, saying specifically this is congruent to this, and then you can mark it. If it doesn't give you specifics, like here, there's nothing saying specifically congruent yet. Okay? It doesn't give us pieces with a symbol like this saying congruent in our given information. So we need to, along the way, explain why those pieces are congruent in our statement column, and then we have to justify why in our reasoning. Okay, so we're going to look at the given information. Now, as far as our first statement and reason, where do we begin? We're going to begin with exactly what we know, the given information. So let's write that down. Here we know that BD bisects side AC, and it tells us that triangle ABC is isosceles. Now, how do I know that? What's my reasoning? That's because that was given to us. A nice first step for all of these problems. The given information, the reasoning, it's because it was given. No reason for anybody to not be able to put these two pieces of information down. Okay? Step 2. Now before I write a statement for step 2, I'm going to look back and mark whatever I can that it tells me is congruent. I don't have anything congruent at the moment, so I'm not going to mark it. Okay. Now, what do I do for my next step? Well, let's base it off of the last piece of information that we were given, okay, or that we've discovered. Here we see that we have BD bisecting AC. What does that mean? It means that this line BD is cutting AC into two equal pieces. That's what it means to bisect. So that means that AD is going to be congruent to piece DC. So we can state that AD is congruent to DC. Okay? Now, how do I know that? What's my reasoning? Well, that's the definition of bisect. Abbreviations are mostly accepted by a lot of professors out there or teachers in general, so I'm okay with it in this class. So if you want to use the abbreviation DEF for definition of bisect, that works for me. Okay. Now, where do we go from here? Well, we've already kind of gotten to a finish with this, that these two pieces are congruent, and we don't have enough to say that the triangles themselves are congruent. So let's look at some more information that they give. It tells us that triangle ABC is isosceles. Well, think about what it means to be isosceles. It means that we have two congruent legs. Okay? We have two congruent legs. So, I know that AB is going to be congruent to BC. So I will list that right here. AB is congruent to BC. The reason is that's also another definition of bisect. Oh, I'm sorry. Definition of isosceles. Oops. Okay, that's the definition of isosceles, right? Because it told us it was isosceles. That gives us the opposite sides congruent. I'm sorry, the legs congruent. Alright. Now, we know that we're going to be using side, side, side because that's really what we've been focusing on, but we also think that we should be using side, side, side because I can see that I have this triangle here that has 1, 2, and 3 sides, and I already know that I have a side, and another side that's being shared. So as soon as I see the idea of these two triangles sharing a side, I should try to make sure that I mention that that side itself is congruent. Now, how am I going to get that? The reflexive property. Reflexive property tells us that a piece is congruent to itself, meaning BD is congruent to BD. BD is congruent to BD, which is itself, and we said that that was the reflective property. Now I have side, 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 right? I have a side congruent, I have two sides congruent, I have three sides congruent on both triangles. So I can now state with a valid statement ABD is going to be congruent to triangle. Now I'm going to make sure I'm doing a valid statement CBD. And we used side, side, side congruency. Now remember what we're trying to prove here. We're trying to prove congruent angles. In particular, ABD congruent to CBD. That's what we're trying to prove. But we actually have it. We discussed earlier that if we can get all the sides congruent, it makes the triangle itself congruent using CP/CTC, which means that these angles, which we're trying to prove, are congruent through CP/CTC. Finish it off with a little square. Okay, That tells me that this is the end of my proof, and there's no other steps missing. Here's one for you to try on your own. Write it down. Draw the picture, because you want to mark as much congruency and parallels as you can. Okay, the more of those specific pieces you have, the easier it will be to see if you have congruency or not. So take a few minutes, try this one on your own. When you get stuck, maybe press play, and then maybe pause it when you get to the spot that you were stuck on, and then see if you can finish it on your own once you get to that next roadblock. Okay, these are nice that you can, try it and pause along the way if you get stuck. Okay. All right. So we got to make sure that we set up our statement reason table. Statement reason. Step 1. Remember, step 1 is always the given information. Point E is the midpoint of AC and BD, and AD is congruent to BC. That was all given. Well, let's take a second to mark. Let's see. Point E is the midpoint of AC and BD. Did not say specifically anything congruent. Here we do see specifically two things congruent: AD and BC. We can mark those right away because it tells us that they're congruent. Now let's look at what our statement says up here. It says point E is the midpoint of AC right here, okay, and BD right here. Well, midpoint means that it's halfway through, which means that these two pieces are being cut in half. So that makes AE and EC congruent. Let's make sure that we list that. AC congruent to EC, and that's through the definition of midpoint. Now, we also have from the same piece of information that E is the midpoint of BD. BD is now being cut into two equal pieces, DE and EB. I like to list that under the same step because I'm using the exact same definition. Some teachers might want you to do that in a separate step. Here I'm saying that it's okay to list them because it's for the same reason. So DE is congruent to EB for the same reasoning. Step number 3. Okay, we have congruent triangles, right? And we're trying to prove congruent angles, which are part of those triangles. So now that we have these triangles congruent, let's list it. I'm starting with angle A to D. So I went along this first congruent side. So maybe if I start from C to B, and then from D to E along this third congruent side. So I went from the first to the second to this B, and then need to travel along the third side, so that gives me E over here. That valid statement is very important to get correct for your proof. If you have them out of order, it's going to be considered wrong because you're not listing the proper congruencies, which does not show us that we have congruent triangles. Okay, so we have to make sure that we write this in the valid statement. And how did we know that? Well, we used side, side, side congruency. Now that we have that, we do know that all the angles inside of the triangle are congruent, and the angles that we're looking for specifically are D and B, so we can say safely that angle D is congruent to angle B. Reason for that is because the corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. We can also finish off our proof with the little crossing swords. Okay, that also shows us that we're done with the proof. Okay, I hope that you did alright with this proof. They're tricky, but when you stop and think about them step by step, you mark only the things that are congruent and parallel, if you happen to come across parallel. That will cut down on the confusion and cluster in the picture. But mark the picture, because geometry is very visual, and you want to make sure that you have good visual aids in order to help you explain your thinking and to justify your reasoning.